A woman was sold before she even knew how to pronounce her own name. Years later, humiliated as a dancer in the harem's festivities, everyone expected to see her break. But she never lowered her gaze. That night, before the entire court, while she danced amid mockery and scorn, the heir to the throne watched her, and something in him changed forever. No one imagined that this nameless dancer was about to challenge an entire empire. What would you be willing to risk for love? Welcome to a story as intense as it is deeply moving. Tell me in the comments where you're joining us from, and let me ask you this. Do you believe love can triumph, even when power forbids it? Istanbul, spring of the year 1856. The sun sank slowly over the domes of Topkapi Palace, casting a pale golden glow across the minarets, the tulip gardens, and the high walls guarding the most jealously protected heart of the empire, the harem. Inside, where no man could enter and sighs were more common than words, the women lived like flowers enclosed in a crystal vase, ornamental, silenced, and watched. Safiye had spent 14 years behind those walls. She had arrived at just 8 years old, sold off over a debt her mother had never fully understood. No one explained her fate to her. She only knew that the carriage took her far from her village, from the jasmine-scented mountains, and from the last embrace of a mother she would never see again. Since then, she had learned not to ask questions, not to cry in front of the other women, and to hide her soul behind a still, unreadable gaze. Her days began with the muezzin's call, though she no longer prayed. She rose in silence, washed her hands with rosewater, and dressed according to the harem matron's instructions. That morning she wore ivory silk salver, a gauze blouse embroidered with silver thread, and a deep blue shawl draped over her shoulders like an unspoken promise. Her thick, long hair was braided low and adorned with a single pearl. Barefoot, she moved through the corridors like a nameless sigh. The other odalisques watched her with a mixture of disdain and fear, the kind reserved for what one cannot understand. Safiye didn't seek to please, and yet her presence drew attention the way flame draws the moth. That alone deeply irritated Hanif. Hanif, the Sultan's favorite, reigned among the women with a sharpened smile and a voice as soft as poison. Her beauty was undeniable, pale skin, sky-blue eyes, and hair the color of ashen honey. But beyond her charms, what kept her at the top was her talent for manipulation, division, surveillance. She couldn't bend Safiye to her will, and for that reason she humiliated her whenever she could, spreading rumors, forcing demeaning tasks upon her. "Stay back, peasant," she whispered that morning as she passed Safiye. "Don't poison the air with your withered jasmine scent." Safiye did not respond. She lowered her eyes, not out of fear but strategy. She knew that words were double-edged weapons, and in the harem, even a sigh could lead to ruin. That day the corridors buzzed with rumors. Prince Semel, heir to the throne, was returning from Vienna, where he had spent years studying politics, languages, and science. The women prepared with the anxious energy of those who know that change can bring glory, or ruin. Hanif smiled more than usual, and the seamstresses rushed through the halls, adjusting embroidery, dyeing silks, adorning hairstyles. In the afternoon, the Sultan hosted a banquet to honor his son's return. The central courtyard of the harem was laid with carpets, brocade cushions, brass candelabras, and trays of candied fruits. The air was thick with incense, sweet almonds, and restrained ambition. Safiye had not been granted permission to dance that evening. Her name was not among the chosen. But Hanif, with an innocent smile, whispered to the supervisor. It might be interesting for her to perform a dance. After all, they say she moves like a branch in the wind. Wouldn't that make a lovely contrast? The order was given. Safiye was pushed to the center of the courtyard without preparation, without music, without warning. The other odalisques quietly withdrew, leaving the space empty. A lone drum began to beat softly. Silence fell like a veil. Everyone expected her to refuse, to tremble, to beg. But she stood tall. Slowly, her bare feet touched the warm marble, and her arms began to move as if weaving stories. She did not dance with seduction or fear. She danced with dignity. As one whose only homeland is her own body, whose only armor is her composure. She turned with grace, like a flower unafraid to wither, and with each turn, the deep blue shawl floated around her like a cloud of melancholy. From an upper gallery, hidden behind golden latticework, the Sultan watched in silence. Beside him, a vizier inclined his head. "Does it please you, my lord?" "My son has returned more sentimental than I expected," murmured the Sultan, his gaze unwavering. "And that woman has the look of someone who has already lost everything." Without another word he stood and left. But someone else did not look away. Semel, seated among courtiers and foreign dignitaries, watched the dancer as though trying to recall something forgotten. He did not know her name nor her story. But in the way she raised her arms to the heavens, in the stillness of her expression, there was a sorrow deeper than any spoken word that night. And for the first time in his life, the heir to the Ottoman throne was moved by something he could not explain. The dance ended. There were no applauses. Only a dense, reverent silence. Safi bowed her head, stepped back and vanished into the shadows. But the echo of her presence lingered, like the scent of jasmine that blooms only at night. The murmur slithered like a serpent between brocade cushions, golden goblets, and glances frozen mid-gasp. The drum fell silent. The final note of the flute snapped in the air like a torn silk thread. No one understood what was happening, until Prince Semel, heir to the Ottoman throne, rose to his feet. He did so without raising his voice, without theatrics. It was his presence alone, upright and unwavering among the courtiers, that sent a tremor rippling silently through the atmosphere. His deep blue velvet robe caught the light of the hanging lamps, and his gaze, fixed on the figure disappearing behind the curtains, burned with a strange blend of confusion and something else, something older, more intimate. Something even he could not yet name. "I wish to meet her," he said simply. The words drifted through the air like a leaf on water. He did not shout, did not ask for permission. He declared it. His tone, calm yet firm, shattered protocol like a blade through glass. The women of the harem, trained in calculated and rehearsed obedience, glanced at one another with trembling hands. The viziers exchanged uneasy gestures, while the music, attempting to resume, dissolved into timid chords. No one dared to move. In the side gallery, hidden behind finely carved latticework, the Valide Sultan, Nurbanu, rose with restrained elegance. Her face revealed neither anger nor shock. Only her gray eyes, cold and immovable like the marble of the palace, narrowed with a sharpness few could endure. "Whom do you refer to, your highness?" asked the chamberlain in a cautious bow. "The dancer," Semel replied without shifting his gaze. "The last one who stood in the center." The chamberlain swallowed hard. He knew exactly who the girl was. She held no title among the favorites, no standing that might justify proximity to the heir. And yet, tonight, she had become the center of every gaze. The order was given. As the court struggled to regain composure behind hushed murmurs and painted smiles, a servant girl rushed down the harem corridors, her trembling fingers guiding her steps. Safi stood alone, beside a tall blue ceramic vase. She wasn't crying nor smiling. She was simply watching the moon through the high window, as though searching its light for some distant echo of freedom. When she heard the hurried steps, she didn't flinch. In that place, to be summoned at odd hours could mean many things, and almost none of them good. "The prince has asked to see you," whispered the servant, avoiding her eyes. Safi nodded. She asked no questions. She straightened the shawl on her shoulders and walked barefoot, like a shadow aware of its own fate. She was led to the palace's private gardens, a place forbidden to all but the royal family. It was a place of legend, where it was said the first sultan once courted his great love among almond trees and marble pools. The air there smelled different, freer, fresher, as if the outside world no longer existed. Semel waited by a fountain carved with birds in flight. He wore no crown, yet his bearing spoke louder than any imperial jewel. When he saw her approach, he lowered his eyes for a moment, as if the weight of what he had just done had only now begun to settle upon him. "What is your name?" he asked, breaking the silence. "Safi," she answered, without bowing, without looking away. Semel furrowed his brow slightly. He had expected deference, a trembling voice, the familiar mixture of fear and obedience he had seen countless times. But this woman's tone held the calm of someone who begs for nothing. "You dance with sorrow," he murmured, almost to himself. "I don't dance to bring anyone joy," Safi replied. "I only learned how to move without breaking." A silence stretched between them. The fountain continued to flow. The leaves of the orange trees stirred the air. The moon seemed to lean toward them, curious. "Do you know why I asked to meet you?" he asked, stepping closer. "Because I don't belong here," she said. "Because I don't smile like the others. Because I have nothing to offer you, and that intrigues you." Her candor unsettled him. She wasn't insolent nor combative. She was simply real. And in the world he inhabited, that was rarer than the purest ruby. "Are you offended that I noticed you?" he pressed. "I'm not offended. But I'm not flattered either," she replied. "If I caught your attention, it must have been because of what I didn't say. And when someone is noticed for their silence, they often pay a high price." The prince said nothing. Before him stood a woman who didn't seek to dazzle or please, who did not beg for affection or protection. A woman who, despite her station, spoke with a naked honesty that disarmed him. And he, raised to rule with intelligence and diplomacy, did not know what to do with such truth. "Tomorrow I'll send you something," he said almost without thinking. "I don't need anything. It won't be a gift," he clarified. "I only want you to remember me as someone who asked nothing of you." Safai looked at him intently. For a moment, her amber eyes seemed to dissolve into the night. Then she lowered her gaze, not out of submission but respect, and left without another word. Semel remained in the garden, feeling that something had shifted inside him. Something no statecraft, no journey, no woman had ever stirred. That same night, as the court tried to make sense of what had happened and rumors began to creep like ivy across the palace walls, Semel summoned one of his most trusted men. He requested a detailed report on Safai, her origins, her story, her time in the harem. But upon hearing that her father had been a poet condemned for writing against the crown, the prince did not recoil. On the contrary, he fell into thoughtful silence. Later that night, in his chambers, he penned a note in blue ink, folded it with care and sealed it with wax. He placed it on a silver tray beside a single jasmine bloom, the very one the royal gardener had picked that morning. Then he turned to the window. The Bosphorus shimmered in the distance like a silver wound, and the star-strewn sky seemed to guard the secrets the court was not yet ready to hear. By dawn, his decision had already been made. And when the Valide Sultan heard the news from Semel's own lips, a silence colder than marble settled upon the great gallery. The prince had announced his intention to marry the odalisque who had danced alone, not for his entertainment but for his life. No one said a word. But throughout the corridors of power, the echo of that declaration began to ring like a prophecy. And thus, with a sentence no heir had dared to utter in generations, the fate of the empire began to lean, ever so slowly, toward the heart of a woman who had not been chosen to reign, but was beginning to write her own legend. Bosphorus shimmered in the early light as if the whole world were at peace. And yet, behind the walls of Topkapi Palace, the air had grown thick, heavy with omens and strange silences. Ever since Prince Semel's announcement, the corridors of the harem breathed with unease. The handmaidens whispered among themselves, the elder odalisques avoided dawn had broken over Istanbul with a deceptive clarity. The waters of the looking at Safai, and the younger ones watched her as if she were walking the edge of an abyss. She was no longer just one among them. Her name was now spoken with a mixture of scandal and fear, as if being chosen by the heir were a direct provocation to the invisible balance that ruled every corner of the palace. The Valide Sultan Nurbanu wasted no time responding. Within days she summoned Hanif and the highest-ranking women of the harem in secret. The Women's Council, composed of the former sultan's widows, senior concubines and ladies of Ottoman lineage, gathered in one of the inner chambers, where no sunlight entered and the walls were draped in heavy tapestries that seemed to absorb every word spoken. Nurbanu did not raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her mere presence commanded respect and fear. Seated on a divan embroidered with golden thread, dressed in a violet brocade kaftan and a dark lace veil partially covering her hair, she looked over each woman slowly before speaking. "We face a threat that bears no sword and carries no poison. Its name is disorder," she said, her voice low but razor-sharp. "The dancer who was invisible yesterday now dares to become the face of the empire. Where is our bloodline? Where is our tradition? Who are we if we allow a woman with no name to sit beside the throne?" Hanif, seated to her right, smiled without showing her teeth. "With your permission, my lady, I know that woman's weaknesses. It won't take long before her true nature is revealed." "Then do it," the Valide Sultan commanded. "But with subtlety. We don't need scandal, we need quiet contempt. The people forget screams but never glances." While a strategy to destroy Safai was being woven in that corner of the harem, in another wing of the palace she was already beginning to feel the weight of an invisible punishment. Her favorite fabrics were taken from her. She was denied access to common areas. The servants ignored her as if her very presence were an offense. Her books, few but cherished, disappeared without explanation. Even the lute she had tuned for years was removed from her chamber without notice. What hurt most wasn't the loss of possessions but the isolation. As if her mere existence offended the air itself. She was no longer allowed in the inner gardens, nor to mix with the others. Whenever she tried to walk the halls, a voice would remind her that she did not have permission. And when she asked why, the only response was an evasive stare. Everything seemed to spin without her, as if she were a shadow no one dared to touch. Semel, aware of the shift in how Safai was being treated, attempted to visit her. On the third night after his public declaration, he arrived at the entrance to the harem, accompanied by 2 aides. He carried a small yet meaningful gift, a lacquered box filled with writing pigments and a handkerchief trimmed with lace, woven by the women of Edirne. But at the door he was stopped by Yusuf, the chief eunuch, whose expression was calm. "Your Highness, I have direct orders from the Valide Sultan. No one is allowed to enter Miss Safai's quarters without her consent." "Not even me?" Semel asked, his brow tense. "Especially not you." The prince regarded him in silence for a long moment. He knew Yusuf was loyal to palace order, but also that the man had a mind, and eyes, of his own. Semel did not challenge him. Instead, he inclined his head slightly, placed the gift on a tray and turned away. That same night, once the palace had fallen into its usual haze of scented oil and dimmed lamps, Yusuf made his way with measured steps down the marble halls to Safai's chamber. He knocked only once. She opened the door slowly without asking who it was. Her dark eyes held no fear, but a deep weariness, the kind borne by those who have stopped expecting anything. "The prince sends you this," the eunuch said, extending the box. Safai didn't take it immediately. Her hands remained crossed over her chest. Then, with barely a gesture, Yusuf drew from the folds of his robe a small note wrapped in a linen handkerchief. Inside was a jasmine flower, still fresh, still alive. Safai felt the air stop in her lungs. She took the note, and after the door had closed, she sat by the window's edge. The lit lamp cast her silhouette against the wall, and in her hands the white flower trembled. She closed her eyes for a moment. The scent, soft, clean, brought back a long-lost image. Her mother, kneeling at the entrance of their home in Anatolia, carefully planting the roots of a jasmine bush while whispering, "This flower only grows where the soul endures." The knot in her throat never became tears. She wouldn't allow it. She opened the letter and read Semel's steady handwriting. "Where light cannot reach, memory remains. This flower is not a gift. It is a sign. I ask nothing of you. Only that you don't forget what I saw in you, when no one else was looking." She didn't sleep that night. She remained seated until the sky turned gray with dawn, the flower resting in her lap, feeling that despite the isolation, she was not entirely alone. Meanwhile, in the administrative wing of the palace, a session of the Imperial Council was underway. The viziers debated the delay of a diplomatic delegation from the Balkans, whose arrival had been expected that same week. There were hushed conversations about rising tensions, unanswered letters, and unsettling troop movements. The Sultan, present and attentive, listened without emotion. After a long silence, he turned to Semel. "You've been in Vienna. You know their methods, their language. Handle this matter. If there is a threat, I want to know before anyone else does." The prince nodded. Though his thoughts were elsewhere, he understood the gravity of the moment. The empire could not afford to appear weak, and he could not allow his personal decision to be wielded as proof of instability. That very afternoon, he ordered all overdue diplomatic correspondence to be reviewed, rescheduled upcoming audiences, and delegated all non-urgent matters to his advisors. But when night fell, when no courtiers remained, when the courtyard slumbered beneath the cypress shadows, Semel wrote a second note. He didn't sign it. He simply added one short line. "The flower grows best where no one sees it." Yusuf, as he had the night before, delivered it without a word. And when he saw her receive it with the same quiet and unwavering expression, he understood that something deeper than ambition had begun to take root between them. That Jasmine, so small, so innocent in appearance, had begun to open a crack in the very foundations of the palace. A crack no one yet understood, but one that could no longer be ignored. The mid-spring breeze drifted sweetly over Istanbul, deceptively gentle. From the palace terraces, the Bosphorus could be seen like a silver ribbon dividing empires and concealing secrets. Within Topkapi, however, the breeze did not refresh the air. The currents were of another kind, rumors that traveled faster than carrier pigeons, names whispered in hushed tones, gestures that quietly altered the course of fate. Only 3 days had passed since Semel had openly declared his interest in Safai. And already, the cost of that choice had begun to reveal itself, sometimes subtly, and sometimes with cruelty. One morning, before the sun touched the gilded walls of the harem, a sealed document reached the hands of the Sultan. The report, meticulously prepared, came from the head of imperial intelligence, a man who seldom spoke and whose existence most pretended not to know. The content was brief but striking. Safai was not simply an anonymous odalisque with no surname. She was the daughter of Musa the poet, a man condemned 15 years earlier for composing verses that, in the eyes of the imperial court, incited dangerous thought. Musa had vanished after his sentencing. Some said he died in the dungeons of Anatolia. Others claimed he had been exiled beyond the Caucasus. No one knew for certain. What was certain was that his name remained forbidden in select circles. And now his daughter lived within the palace walls. To some, her blood was a silent threat. To others, an echo of rebellion. The news spread like dry lightning. The Women's Council frowned in unison. The odalisques whispered anxiously, unable to mask their alarm. Some of the more daring viziers, in private meetings, suggested that allowing such a connection would be a sign of weakness from the heir. Valide Sultan Nurbanu, ever impeccable, raised no protest. But she smiled. She knew that one didn't need to dirty their hands when the court itself could be trusted to lift the stones. Semel received the information directly from one of his closest men. Upon reading Musa's name, his first reaction was silence. Then he reread the report, more slowly this time, pausing at the dates, the accusations, the impersonal tone used to describe the father of the woman who had restored light to his eyes. "What am I expected to do with this?" he finally asked. "You're expected, Your Highness, to consider it, to weigh it, to archive it, or to use it." The prince laid the parchment on his desk. He walked to the window and looked out over the palace rooftops, the mosque domes, the boats gliding across the strait. For years he had studied strategy, diplomacy, treaties, but none had taught him how to react to the name of a woman. That very afternoon he decided to face his father. The Sultan received him in the council hall, accompanied by 2 viziers and his personal scribe. This was no informal audience. It was a moment heavy with unspoken expectation, as though even the walls awaited something that might tilt the balance of centuries. Semel did not kneel. He did not speak with anger. He simply stated what he thought, with clarity and without embellishment. "I know who she is," he said, "and I don't care. If she inherited anything from her father, it was the ability to feel. And that is not a crime. Not yet." The Sultan looked at him without blinking. His eyes were sunken, his brows gray, and his calm so cold it could extinguish fire. He was silent for several seconds before finally saying, "What you say is noble. But the crown is not given to those who love. It is given to those who obey. Then am I no longer worthy of it?" Semel asked, voice steady. "You must decide if you still are," replied the Sultan, and left, trailing behind him a silence no scribe could ever record. That same night, Safiye was quietly relocated to a remote residence within the palace complex. It was not an official punishment. She was not escorted in chains and no formal announcement was made. It was a soft transfer wrapped in discretion, but heavy with meaning. The place was an old pavilion covered in ivy, at the end of a corridor long since forgotten. Once part of the harem decades ago, now only a few pieces of furniture and a rusted lamp remained. Safiye asked no questions. She understood that sudden changes were the way power reminded wildflowers not to grow too tall. The next morning, while exploring the grounds, she found a small, forgotten garden surrounded by stone walls and overgrown with weeds. Among the thickets, a few plants still bloomed timidly, and among them, several jasmine bushes, their white flowers incongruous amidst the decay. She approached and touched one of the stems with the tips of her fingers. The scent was unmistakable. The same her mother had cultivated at the entrance of their home. The same the prince had sent her wrapped in a letter. That was where Yusuf found her. "This place hasn't been visited in years," he said quietly. "What was it before?" she asked without turning around. "It belonged to a concubine," replied the eunuch. "A woman who died young, no children, no alliances, no scandals. She was loved by few and feared by others. When she passed, no one dared to take her place. They say her soul still lingers among these flowers." Safiye closed her eyes and breathed deeply. "Then I don't mind sharing it with her." Yusuf regarded her with a respect that required no words. He withdrew in silence, leaving behind only the whisper of wind rustling through the branches. From that day on, the garden became Safiye's refuge. She found an old notebook on one of the shelves and began to write. Not letters. Not for anyone. She didn't expect anyone to read them. But with every line of ink, the weight of solitude felt lighter. At least her story wouldn't be lost among the folds of forgetfulness. She wrote of her childhood, of her father's voice reciting verses by the fire, of the fear she felt the first time she saw the palace walls, of the humiliation of dancing before strangers, of the moment a white flower changed the course of her thoughts. Sometimes she wrote at night, when the jasmine blossoms opened beneath the moon. Other times at dawn, when the world had not yet remembered she existed. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She simply wrote. And as she did, the invisible roots of a forbidden flower began to grow beneath the foundations of the empire. A flower that, despite abandonment, kept blooming. The sky above Istanbul dawned beneath a heavy layer of clouds, thick with secrets woven into their folds. Inside the palace, that same gray veil seemed to settle over the corridors, the tapestries, the faces that avoided each other's gaze. The air was not charged with storm, but with something older, more invisible and dangerous: intrigue. Hanif walked through the corridors of the harem with feline grace, draped in an emerald green velvet kaftan that traced the contours of her figure with arrogant elegance. Her expression was that of a woman who did not believe in surrender. To her, there was no such thing as humiliation, only strategic setbacks. She had lost influence, yes, but not power. And in the game of palace women, power was not measured by granted privileges, but by what one could provoke with a well-placed word, or a calculated silence. For days she watched, listened, and waited. She knew Prince Semel remained away from the harem, preoccupied with diplomatic tensions in the Balkans, and that the court's attention flowed like oil over matters of greater state. It was the perfect moment to act. That was when she devised her plan. With the help of a young and ambitious servant girl, whose eager eyes betrayed her thirst for approval, Hanif crafted an accusation against Safai. The content was delicate: subtle suggestions of witchcraft, strange words whispered in prayer, seductive behavior designed to manipulate the air. Nothing too explicit. Just enough to ignite scandal in the right circles. The complaint was written in trembling script, as if born of the anguish of a witness compelled to speak by conscience. Hanif handed the parchment to one of Valide Sultan Nurbanu's most trusted ladies, who discreetly filed it into the archive reserved for internal matters of the harem. There, any accusation, no matter how minor, was recorded, sealed, and used at the appropriate moment. But she hadn't counted on a pair of eyes that saw everything from the shadows. Yusuf, the chief eunuch, discovered the document during a routine inspection. It was not his duty to review such letters, but something in the seal, something in the haste with which it had been placed, compelled him to open it. He did not frown. He did not curse. He simply folded it carefully and slipped it inside his robe. That same afternoon, as Semel exited a meeting with 2 foreign emissaries, Yusuf approached him under the pretense of delivering a confidential security report. In private, the eunuch laid the parchment on the table and stepped back. "Read this, Your Highness," he said. "It's not a diplomatic matter. But it could become one." Semel unrolled the document. At first, his face remained unreadable. But as his eyes moved over the lines, his jaw tightened and his brow furrowed. He didn't need to ask where it had come from. It wasn't the first time he suspected Hanif's hand, but never had he held such clear, such cowardly proof. "Does Safai know of this?" he asked. "No," Yusuf replied. "I intercepted it before it reached the council. It's unrecorded. No one else has seen it." "Then I'll make sure it's heard from my voice," Semel said low and firm. The confrontation did not wait. The next morning, during an open audience in the harem's inner courtyard, the prince appeared unexpectedly, document in hand. The women, startled, stepped aside at the sight of him crossing the threshold unannounced. In that space, his visits were rare and always preceded by formal notice. This act broke an ancestral protocol. Hanif, seated among the others, tried to maintain composure, but the tension in her neck betrayed her. Semel stopped before her and held out the parchment. "Is this your work?" he asked. Hanif looked at him with proud defiance. "I don't know what I'm being accused of, Your Highness." "I'm not accusing you. I'm holding up a mirror." He opened the document and read it aloud. The murmuring among the women grew into a rising hum. The prince didn't raise his voice, but each word was a blade. When he finished, he tore the parchment into small pieces and let them fall to the floor like ashes. "If there's anything worse than lying, it is lying with elegance. And if I ever respected you, Hanif, today I bury that respect alongside your words." She did not respond. She knew that, in that moment, any word could seal her fate. Hours later, Semel was summoned to his mother's quarters. Valide Sultan Nurbanu showed no surprise. Dressed in black, as was her custom when gravity was to be conveyed, she received him without courtesy. "You've defied the harem, the court, and now me. For a woman whose blood is a threat and whose presence divides. What more are you willing to risk?" "Everything," he replied. "Because when one chooses what is right, it is not a risk. It is honor." "And if the empire falls for that choice," she countered, "then let it fall with truth, he said, turning to leave. That night, as the moon rose over the gardens and oil lamps flickered behind the lattice screens, the unthinkable occurred. Safi, seated in her quarters, noticed a strange taste in the water she had been brought. It was not immediate. It was subtle, a burn in her throat, a wave of dizziness, a hollow ache in her stomach. She braced herself against the wall, trying not to collapse. The lamp beside her crashed to the floor, unbroken, but enough to draw the attention of the one who mattered. Yusuf arrived within minutes. Upon seeing her pale and trembling on the floor, he didn't call for help. He lifted her into his arms and rushed her to a hidden chamber, where a few aging slave women still preserved the knowledge of herbs and antidotes. They gave her a thick, bitter infusion, while Yusuf held her hand, refusing to let her close her eyes. Hours later, when she could finally open them, her voice was barely a whisper. "Why?" "Because it wasn't your end yet," he answered without loosening his grip. The news never reached the court. It was silenced efficiently. But in the days that followed, Hanif was quietly removed from her chambers, escorted without drama or protest to a guarded residence on the palace's outer edge. No one saw her off. No one wept. 1 week later, she was discreetly exiled to a remote estate on the eastern frontier of the empire. She was forbidden to return to Istanbul, and her name ceased to be spoken in the circles she had once ruled. Still weak, Safi returned to the jasmine garden. She sat beside the bush that bloomed most, resting her forehead against her knees. She didn't cry. But her breath, ragged and silent, spoke of a life clinging to itself with a strength not even poison could break. The shadow had passed. But roots, once wounded, never forget. Spring crept silently through the gardens of Topkapi, and yet, in the secluded pavilion where Safi now lived, time seemed to have come to a halt. New leaves sprouted shyly, the jasmine began to perfume the night air, but in her eyes, a shadow had taken root, one that even the dawn's light could not dispel. She wrote every day. Not out of hope but necessity. The worn leather-bound notebook she kept hidden among her clothes had become her only confidant, one that could listen without judgment. In it, Safi poured scattered thoughts, restrained fears, and unanswered questions. She also scribbled fragments of poetry she remembered from her father, phrases she didn't fully understand, but that surfaced from her memory as though he were dictating them from some forgotten corner of her soul. One night, under a high moon, weary of enduring in silence, she left the notebook open on the wooden ledge near the window, never imagining someone would find it. It was Semel who, visiting the pavilion in her absence, driven by the need to see something of her, to inhale the faint trace of her scent from the walls, to touch even the shadow of her presence, found the notebook left ajar. He picked it up gently as if it were something fragile and began to read. Not to pry but because he could not stop himself. The first lines struck him with a frankness he had not anticipated. "I don't know if he sees me, or only the reflection of his desire to rebel. What if I'm nothing more than an excuse, a distraction from a destiny already written?" Semel froze. He continued reading. The words were not bitter but deeply sorrowful. There was no reproach, only doubt. A quiet, honest doubt born from the fear of loving without being loved in return. As he read further, he found thoughts braided with memories, questions whispered onto the page as though she had written them more for herself than for anyone else. And then, with barely a transition, verses appeared. "The wings that cannot be seen are the ones that weigh the most. What is not said becomes root. Don't look at me with promises, look at me with memory." Semel recognized the voice. He didn't know how, but those phrases carried the scent of poetry he had once heard at court, long before he ever knew Safi's name. An old, forbidden voice. Musa, the silenced poet. And suddenly it struck him, these verses were his. What he held in his hands was not merely a journal, was a legacy. A wave of dizziness overtook him. He closed the notebook abruptly. Something inside his chest tightened with a mixture of pain and disorientation. He couldn't say what hurt more, the content itself or the realization that she had doubted him. He thought of the dangers he had faced to protect her, the lines he had crossed. And yet, did she truly believe she was just a distraction? He left without speaking to anyone. From that day on, something changed in Semel. He no longer visited her. He sent no flowers, no letters. He asked no questions about her condition. The affairs of the empire became his shield, and behind that shield, he buried his wound with the same silence he had once admired in her. Safi, noticing his absence, was not immediately surprised. She thought perhaps his duties kept him away. But as the days passed without word, without gesture, without a single sign, a sharp ache began to settle inside her. It wasn't anger. It was a bitter emptiness lodged in her chest, which not even the garden breeze could dissolve. She sat before the blooming jasmine bushes with her back straight, her face serene, her lips sealed, but inside, everything trembled. Doubt grew. Had she been foolish to believe a man like him could alter the course of history for someone like her? One afternoon, as the sky turned shades of violet, an unexpected visitor arrived. Valide Sultan Nurbanu appeared at the threshold of the pavilion, unannounced, unaccompanied. She wore a black kaftan embroidered in silver thread, and a sheer veil that revealed the gleam in her eyes, cold as the marble fountains of the palace. Safai stood slowly, surprised but not intimidated. She offered a slight bow, restrained in form. Nurbanu studied her in silence for several long moments, as though reading every line of her face. "This place is more austere than I imagined," she said at last. "It is enough for someone like me," Safai replied softly. "Someone like you?" the Sultan repeated, not hiding her irony. "And what does that mean? The daughter of an exiled poet? A woman who writes nameless verses while the empire bleeds at distant borders?" Safai said nothing. Nurbanu walked to a chair and sat with the poised elegance of someone trained to command even the air around her. "I've come to offer you something," she continued. "An exit. Quiet, dignified. A residence in the provinces. Far from the court. Far from the prince. You could live in peace, without fear, without poison, without eyes that cut you like blades." The proposal floated between them like a silk veil. Safai drew in a deep breath. She looked toward the garden. The oldest jasmine bush was in full bloom, covering the wall in white and fragrance. She remembered her mother's voice, her father's verses, the feel of the notebook in her hands. "And if I refuse?" she asked, steady. "Then there will be no warnings. Only consequences." Safai looked directly at her at last. Her voice, when it came, was quiet but firm. "I did not come to this place by choice. But I will not let anyone remove me as if I were a stone in the path. I'm not leaving." Nurbanu rose slowly. Her face showed no surprise. Only the faintest curve of her lips, as if she had already expected that answer. "You're more stubborn than you appear. And you're more predictable than I thought," Safai replied without raising her tone. The Sultan said nothing more. She walked to the door and before crossing the threshold she paused. "You're alone now, girl. And when one is alone, even shadows can become enemies. I've lived more alone than you can imagine. And still, I am standing." Nurbanu left without looking back. Her perfume lingered in the air, thick and bitter like an unsigned warning. Safai sat once more before the garden. She picked up the notebook, opened it, and this time wrote a new line without thinking too much. "When silence is chosen, it is not emptiness. It is strength." Then she closed her eyes and for the first time in a long while, a single tear rolled down her cheek. Not from defeat, not from fear, but from the certainty that, even when everything else is lost, her voice would remain alive, written among the roots of the jasmine, where no one else dared to look. Dawn arrived over Istanbul wrapped in a soft veil of mist, as if the sky itself hesitated to fully reveal itself. Topkapi Palace awoke in its solemn rhythm, footsteps muffled by carpets, voices gliding like echoes between columns. But in the mind of Prince Semel, time had seemed to stop ever since he had closed that notebook. For days he avoided looking at it. He had left it on his desk, buried among diplomatic scrolls and military reports, as if it didn't belong in his world. Yet every time he passed by, he felt the invisible weight of those words. The faded ink lines returned to him unbidden, carrying her voice, contained, without plea, without ornament, yet full of truth. One night, unable to resist the unrest within him, he opened the notebook again. This time not with the judgment of a wounded man, but with the eyes of someone who needed to understand. He reread the entries with a different calm, and there, amid the murmur of thoughts and doubts, he understood. They were not reproaches, not accusations. They were releases, confessions written in solitude for a reader who was never meant to exist. And in that instant he knew what he had to do. The following morning, he presented himself before the Imperial Council with the same composure he had carried into diplomatic battles. The viziers received him with tense expressions, knowing the heir bore a decision that might crack the foundations of protocol. He wore a dark kaftan, simple, unadorned, but his presence filled the chamber. He stood before the heavy velvet curtain, raised his head and spoke with steady voice. "I was taught since childhood to value the empire's stability, to place duty above desire. I have done that. I have served. I have learned. But I will not renounce the truth. The ministers exchanged uneasy glances. One dared to speak. "What are you referring to, Your Highness?" "I mean that if I am not allowed to marry the woman I have chosen, I will not take the throne," he said without hesitation. The silence that followed was thick, cutting. "Are you willing to give up your right?" asked another vizier. "I am willing to be a man before I am a prince," he answered. "And I will not beg for love on a throne that denies me the dignity to love freely." He said no more. He left the chamber behind him, trailing the first gusts of a storm barely forming. That very afternoon, Nurbanu was summoned to the council. For the first time in years, she was not accompanied by her ladies or personal advisors. She entered alone, dressed in her customary dark elegance, her lips tight, her pace slower. She knew the balance had shifted. She was no longer the most respected voice in the palace. Decisions were no longer made in her shadow. The oldest vizier spoke plainly. "Your Majesty, the heir has spoken. If the empire is to remain strong, it cannot do so while ignoring the will of the one who will govern it. And if he has chosen, we must yield." Nurbanu said nothing. She gave a subtle nod and left the room without a word. In the harem, Hanife's fall was even more discreet. Despite her prior confinement, some still feared her. But when evidence of her involvement in the poisoning began circulating among the Sultan's most trusted women, silence turned into rejection. No one defended her anymore, and her once feared name faded into the corner of uncomfortable memories. Safai, unaware of what transpired in the halls of power, continued writing in her notebook, still not knowing whether anyone would ever return for her. At times, she stepped into the garden with a shawl over her shoulders, more from habit than from cold. She walked slowly, unhurried, as if each step helped her recover something she hadn't realized she had lost. That afternoon, the air smelled of jasmine with an intensity that only came on windless days. The garden had begun to bloom fully. The once withered bushes were now covered in white flowers that trembled lightly in the stillness. She looked at them with a mix of tenderness and awe, as if she hadn't expected life to insist on returning. And then she saw him. Semel appeared at the edge of the garden, dressed simply, without formalities, without guards. He walked toward her with firm, measured steps. There was no ceremony, no unnecessary words. Only the presence of two people who had carried in their chests for too long what could not be spoken aloud. Safai looked at him, unmoving. He stopped a short distance from her. "I read your letters," he said. She lowered her eyes, not with shame but with quiet melancholy. "They weren't meant to be read," she whispered. Semel nodded, his voice barely held together by emotion. "I know, but I read them. And I understood that your words weren't meant to hurt me. They were a mirror. One I didn't know how to face in time." Safai looked at him then, and for a moment, the weight of her story seemed to float between them, suspended in that garden where no one else existed. "What goes unspoken," she replied, "sometimes screams louder than words." Semel stepped closer. He didn't touch her. He didn't extend a hand. He simply looked at her with a mix of respect, tenderness, and something deeper, admiration, not declared with flowers or grand gestures, but with a quiet decision to remain. "I came back because I realized I didn't choose you to defy the world. I chose you because your silence taught me how to listen." Safai closed her eyes briefly, inhaled deeply. When she opened them again, her pupils mirrored the white of the jasmine blooming around her. "And I never asked to be heard. I only didn't want to be erased." They walked then through the garden, without touching, without needing to say more. Their steps were parallel but not distant. The jasmine whispered around them, as if every flower had chosen to bloom just for that moment. From one of the high galleries, Yusuf watched in silence. He didn't smile. He simply bowed his head, like one offering thanks for something that, at last, had found its way. The garden was blooming again. Not just from the season or the care. It bloomed because it had ceased to be a prison and had become a promise. Because among its roots still lived the memory of a forgotten woman. And now, too, the rebirth of another who, without ever seeking it, had written her place in history. Illness came upon the Sultan as all tragic news do, without warning, without sound, without mercy. At first, it was a persistent cough, then a fever that refused to yield to infusions or prayers. As the days passed, his face turned pale like the marble of the fountains, and his hands, once firm as they signed decrees, trembled as they struggled to hold the amber rosary he always carried. The entire palace knew, though no one spoke it aloud. The lamps burned longer into the night, the eunuchs spoke less, and the women of the harem avoided the laughter that had once been their habit. The empire, even if it did not admit it, feared that the Sultan's breath might fade at any moment. Semel, fully aware of his father's frailty, requested a private audience. It was not a decision he took lightly. Time pressed on, and unspoken words had begun to turn dangerous. The request was granted. The heir would not go alone. Safai would accompany him. That morning, the sky awoke leaden, covered by a blanket of low-hanging clouds reflected in the waters of the Bosphorus with a melancholy gray. The air was heavy, and every corner of the palace seemed to hold its breath. Safai was led by Yusuf through a corridor few knew. She wore an ivory silk antari, modest, free of unnecessary adornment. Her hair was gathered simply, and a translucent veil draped over her shoulders. Her steps were steady, though her hands trembled ever so slightly. Semel awaited her at the entrance to the Sultan's chamber. When he saw her arrive, he said nothing. He offered her his arm in silence, and she accepted it with a quiet nod. Together they crossed the threshold. The room was spacious, bathed in softened light filtered through heavy curtains. The Sultan rested on a dark wooden bed, surrounded by embroidered cushions and tapestries that whispered of past victories. His face was gaunt, but his eyes retained the sharpness of one who still knew how to read truth in a single gesture. At the sight of his son, he offered a faint smile. Upon seeing Safai, his expression became unreadable. Semel approached and knelt beside the bed. "Father, I come to you not as your heir but as your son." The Sultan nodded slightly, inviting him to continue. "You know what I desire. But I have not come to beg. I have come to show you that I stray not out of whim, but out of conviction." Then he took Safai's hand and brought her closer. She said nothing. She merely lowered her gaze in respect. She has been tested by scorn, by silence, by solitude. She does not seek crowns or favor. She has remained standing when everything sought to break her. And still she has asked for nothing. I chose her not for what she offered me, but for what she awakened in me, the certainty that duty and the heart need not always be at war. A long silence followed. The Sultan studied the young woman. Not with tenderness, but with the ancient gaze of one who can discern what is false from what is real. Safai held his gaze without fear, without defiance, with the calm of someone who no longer expects to be understood. At last the Sultan spoke. His voice was low but clear. "I have not lived to please the court, but I know well what is whispered in its shadows. Blood is not cleansed by vows, and the memory of this palace is long. If you take this path, know that many will never forgive it." "I know," said Semel. "And you," he added, turning to Safai, "are you willing to walk without honor in the eyes of those who do not know you?" Safai answered with a firmness that sought no approval. "I am willing not to pretend to be what I am not, and to hold the gaze of those who call me a rootless flower." The Sultan narrowed his eyes. For a moment his breathing seemed to halt. Then with effort he raised his hand and placed his fingers over his son's. "Then so be it. But do not expect applause. This court does not forget easily. Yet sometimes, what is shouted in anger becomes what is most respected in time." That afternoon the news raced through the palace like a lightning bolt. Some received it with outrage, others with confusion, and a few, in silence, felt that the wind had begun to shift direction. In the streets of Istanbul the story passed from mouth to mouth. No one knew exactly who the woman was, but they said she had once been a dancer in the harem, that she had been humiliated, and still the prince had chosen to marry her. Poets began to call her the flower of the harem. Not for her beauty but for her endurance. Against all expectations, Semel did not arrange a private ceremony. He wanted the entire palace to see with their own eyes the truth of his choice. He ordered a modest but public wedding. He invited the viziers, the ladies of the court, the eunuchs, the women of the harem. Even foreign envoys were permitted to attend. The courtyard of the cherry trees was prepared with restraint. No golden arches, no flowing fountains. Only a tapestry spread over the marble and white curtains swaying in the breeze. Safai appeared dressed in pearl white, no jewels, no crown. She walked alone to the center of the courtyard beneath the gaze of all. Semel waited with his eyes fixed on her, unable to hide the emotion brimming in them. When the time came to speak, Safai raised her voice with the same calm with which she had once endured contempt. "I am not here because I was offered a title," she said, "nor because I sought to belong to this world. I am here because someone chose to see beyond what others saw. I was called a flower but without a garden, a woman but without lineage. And yet, I was chosen not for what I showed, but for what I kept hidden." The silence that followed was absolute. Then Semel took the floor. He drew from within his robes a small rolled parchment. He unfolded it gently and read. The words that are never spoken. sink into the earth, and there they bloom, not with noise, but with root. The verse echoed among the columns. Some recognized it. It was by Musa, the exiled poet, Safi's father. A man whose name had been erased, but whose voice lived on in the daughter who now, without raising her fist or raising her voice, returned to history through tenderness. The elder counselors looked at each other with misted eyes. They said nothing. But they knew in that moment they were witnessing something that would not be repeated. Love, that word so often misused, had defied an empire, and had made it bloom. The palace no longer felt the same. Though the corridors remained vast, the tapestries radiant, and the gardens meticulously groomed, a new solemnity had settled into every corner. It wasn't sadness or fear. It was something deeper, heavier, the weight of history pressing slowly onto the shoulders of those who still breathed within its walls. Safi, now the lawful wife of the heir, awoke each day as if it were the first. Her chamber, once modest, had been transformed into the quarters of a consort, adorned with Damascus carpets, carved folding screens, and a cedarwood vanity that stored more protocol than secrets. But it wasn't the luxury that unsettled her, it was the new silence that surrounded her. A silence unlike the one in the harem. This silence held no scorn, but neither did it hold affection. It was a political silence, calculated, made up of glances that paused just before meeting hers, of bows that concealed judgments, of words measured to the syllable so as not to betray opinion. The nobility regarded her with a blend of skepticism and fear masked as courtesy. The elder ladies of the palace whispered behind their fans, poorly veiling their doubts. Still, Safi kept her head high. Not because she felt secure, but because she knew that if she lowered her gaze, a single whisper might unravel everything she had gained. Under the instruction of an Armenian governess who spoke little but corrected much, she began learning the codes of the imperial court. When to smile, when to remain silent, how to read between lines, and how to bow just deeply enough to show dignity without insolence. She learned that diplomacy does not begin with letters, but with the pauses between words. Yet amid all the rehearsals for perfection, her only true refuge remained the garden. With the help of Yusuf, who remained loyal to every shadow she passed through, Safi transformed the jasmine garden into more than a quiet corner of blooms. She personally scrubbed the cracked marble, had the low walls repaired, and discreetly opened the gates to a few women from the harem. Not many, only those like her who had been forgotten. Those who still wept in silence after everyone else had fallen asleep. There, among the scent of jasmine and voices muted by fear, a quiet act of resistance was born each day. No proclamations, no swords, just a place where dignity dared to bloom again. It was Yusuf who, one afternoon, told her of the Sultana Nurbanu's condition. "She hasn't left her chambers in 4 days," he said gravely. "The harem's physicians call it exhaustion, but I've seen that look before. It's the body of someone who no longer wishes to fight." Safi said nothing. For a moment, she thought the woman might fade without ever speaking her name again. But the next morning an unexpected message arrived. The Sultana had requested to see her. She presented herself respectfully dressed, wearing no adornments that could seem insolent. Upon entering, she sensed the change immediately. Nurbanu sat on a chaise longue by the window, draped in a velvet blue shawl that could no longer disguise the pallor of her skin. Her hair, once tightly bound, now fell in soft waves streaked with silver. There were no formal greetings. "I asked so many times for them to keep you from my sight," Nurbanu said, not looking at her directly. "And now it is I who calls for you." Safi remained silent. Her expression held no irony, only quiet expectation. "I have lost," the older woman continued. "Not only my son's favor but the certainty of my own choices. I saw you as a threat, a humiliation, a weakness. But time, that cursed teacher, has come to tell me you may have been exactly what he needed, and I failed to see it." Safi's eyes shimmered, not with vanity, but with the strange pain of watching someone who had wounded her so deeply now collapse. "I never wanted to take your place," she said softly. "I only wanted not to be erased." Nurbanu offered a faint smile, tinged with a sadness that no longer sought redemption. "Take care of him. He is strong but not invincible. Like his father. Like all of us." Safi bowed in silence. When she left that chamber, she knew she would not see the Sultana alive again. A few days later, the Imperial Council convened an extraordinary session. The Sultan, barely conscious, signed with a trembling hand his most delicate decision yet, to appoint Semel as temporary regent. The empire needed a visible face, a steady voice, a shield against the unrest already whispering on the wind. and it was more than just a whisper. A letter arrived from Vienna bearing strange symbols. It was a diplomatic missive sent months earlier, now returned with an added mark in invisible ink. The vizier in charge of foreign trade brought it to the new regent, and Semmel, now accustomed to trusting Safi's insight, asked her to examine it. Safi spent the night locked in the library, surrounded by ancient papyri, manuscripts from her father's archive, and inks mixed with ash to reveal the hidden. By dawn she had found what she was looking for. The encrypted message spoke of an agreement between two rival powers, planning to weaken the empire from within, starting a revolt in one of its most vulnerable provinces. It was a silent betrayal. Thanks to her discovery, Semmel was able to act swiftly. Loyal emissaries were sent out, the brewing chaos contained before it could erupt. And the council, though still wary of Safi, was forced to admit that without her, the empire would have bled from its weakest flank. That night, as the palace slept, Safi returned to the garden. In her hands, she held a small inscription carved with Yusuf's help. She buried it beside one of the oldest jasmine roots, like a secret meant only for time to read. It bore no name, only a verse. The soul that was silenced, did not yield, took root, where no one thought it would. And there, beneath the mantle of the empire, where so many had been forgotten, bloomed the voice of a woman without a crown, but with a legacy no longer denied. The sun had barely risen over the golden domes of the Topkapi Palace when silence fell completely. It was not the silence of the night, nor the silence of intrigue. It was something else entirely, the solemn hush that precedes either the death of an empire, or its rebirth. The Sultan had drawn his final breath just before dawn. There were no bells, no cries, no public mourning. Only a brief decree, swiftly delivered through the hands of eunuchs. The sovereign had passed peacefully, and Semmel, his son, was to be proclaimed within hours as the new guardian of the Ottoman throne. In the inner chamber where the body lay, the oldest viziers bowed their heads in reverence. Not for the life that had faded, but for the weight it left behind. And as preparations began with a haste masked as serenity, in another wing of the palace, a woman dressed slowly. Safi studied her reflection in a polished bronze mirror. Her entari was a deep blue, with no golden embroidery or pearls, only a band of ivory lace at the cuffs. Her hair was tied back with precision. A pin with a dull stone held her veil in place. She was not the image of a queen adorned with borrowed glory. She was the image of a woman who had learned never to ask permission to exist. And yet, her heart pounded. Not with fear, but with the clear understanding that every step she took from that day forward would not be hers alone. It would belong to all the women who had come before, and all those who had yet to be born. The palace corridors bustled with movement. Eunuchs, diplomats, ceremonial guards, maidservants, attendants, all moved with the restrained urgency of those who knew a new order was about to begin. But when she appeared, the murmurs ceased. Some lowered their eyes. Others, the same who had once humiliated her in the harem's corridors, held her gaze with feigned indifference. There was no smile on her face. Only a quiet dignity, woven from memory and endurance. She crossed the main courtyard without escorts. No one announced her. No one accompanied her. And yet no one dared to stop her. The Imperial Hall of Proclamation, adorned with silk tapestries and crystal chandeliers, was already filled. Viziers, foreign ambassadors, high-ranking military officers, noble women of the Ottoman court, all awaited the entrance of the new sovereign. When Semmel appeared, dressed in a cloak embroidered with golden threads and a simple turban, the murmurs swelled for a moment, like a wave recognizing the gravity of its own arrival. The young man stepped to the center of the dais, where a lectern held the open Quran. After a brief prayer, he placed his right hand upon the sacred text and spoke the words that would officially bind him to sovereignty. But before concluding the ceremony, he raised his gaze to the gathering and lifted his voice. "Today marks the beginning of a new era for our empire," he said with calm resolve. "An era where strength will no longer be measured by the sword alone, nor nobility by inherited bloodlines. Today, before being crowned, I wish to pay tribute to the one who taught me that true power is born from dignity." A gentle stir moved through the room. A few heads turned discreetly. "Not all will remember this day for the decrees signed," Semmel continued. "But many will recall the night years ago, when a dancer was forced to entertain those who saw nothing beyond her garments. I, however, saw something different, a flame that would not die under shame. A flower growing in the most forgotten corner of the palace. And I understood then that the strongest roots are not born from power, but from pain transformed into courage." Safi's eyes welled with tears, but she did not look away. "Safi," he said, his voice steady, "today you are my wife, my consort, my life's companion. But before that you were my mirror. And because of you this throne shall, from this day forward, be less arrogant, and more just." There was no applause. It was not custom. But the silence that followed his words was more eloquent than any celebration. It was the unspoken acknowledgement of a court that, at last, had to accept what it had denied for years. Safai walked to the dais and stood beside him. She needed no words. Her very presence, before the same people who had once scorned her, was a declaration in itself. The ceremony ended, but the story was only just beginning. Days later, women in the harem began whispering her story. Some with awe, others with disbelief. They said she was born in the shadows, sold as a child, that she had survived poison, intrigue, humiliation. And yet there she stood beside the new sultan. Not as an ornament, but as the woman who, without a crown, had changed the course of an empire. In the jasmine garden, restored with care and quiet hands, a different peace could be felt. The blossoms grew with greater vigor. The white gravel paths glowed softly beneath the sun. On one of the entrance walls, a new inscription had been carved into a slab of white marble. Read, "Here bloomed a woman without a crown, and changed a throne." There was no signature. None was needed. And so, as the empire moved forward with new steps, bearing the weight of its past and the quiet promise of renewal, Safai walked each morning among the jasmine, her feet firmly grounded on the soil that once denied her. She no longer feared the shadows. Because now she knew, even in the darkest corners, light could bloom. And sometimes, a single flower is enough to challenge the entire world. 8 springs had passed since that morning when the empire's fate was forever altered. The palace still stood as majestic as ever, but the echoes that now ran through its corridors were different. Where once whispers of intrigue had thrived, stories now blossomed. And among them all, one remained alive, like the lingering scent of jasmine on warm nights, the story of Safai and Semel. Sultan Semel ruled with the calm of a man who had learned early that power could not be upheld by sword or fear alone. At his side, Safai walked with the same dignity that had once saved her from oblivion. Her gaze, still deep and composed, spoke of sleepless nights, of difficult choices, of wounds that had healed without ever fully ceasing to ache. They had 2 children. A girl named Layla with dark eyes and an untamable will, and a boy, Karam, who inherited his father's calm and his mother's strength. The people called them the blossoms of the garden, for they were born in spring, when the jasmines bloomed with more vigor than ever before. The harem was no longer what it once had been. Under Safai's quiet yet firm influence, many of its cruelest customs had been abolished. A school was established for the young women who entered, a place where they learned to read, to study science and music, and not merely obedience and silence. The Jasmine House, as it came to be known, was a newly built wing of the palace that served as both refuge and place of learning for women who had once had no other choice but resignation. Yusuf, loyal until his final breath, remained the silent guardian of the palace's secrets. He had aged, yes, but his eyes were still sharp, just as they had been when he protected Safai from Hanif's wrath. The latter, meanwhile, never returned from exile. It was said she lived somewhere in the east, in a crumbling estate filled with ruins and regret, clinging to a name that no one feared anymore. She paid dearly for her ambition, not with death, but with something crueler, oblivion. Sultana Nurbanu had passed away in peace. Her tomb, modest yet adorned with graceful calligraphy, was visited each year by Safai, always in silence. Not out of affection, but because she understood that history is built not only with those we love, but also with those who force us to endure. The days passed with the sweetness of duty fulfilled. The nights were quieter. And though the throne remained a place of solitude and endless wait, Semel always found a moment to sit with his wife in the garden, beneath the same tree where years ago she had buried a secret inscription. One autumn afternoon, when the leaves were turning gold, Layla, only 7 years old, found that very stone while playing among the bushes. She ran with it in her arms to where her parents were sitting. "Did you write this, mother?" she asked, eyes shining with wonder. Safai ran her fingers gently over the stone. She no longer remembered exactly when she had written it. She only knew she had done so when she still doubted her place in the world. She read it aloud, slowly. "The soul once silenced, did not surrender, took root, where none thought it could." Layla looked at her, puzzled but fascinated. "What does it mean?" Safai smiled, the kind of smile only women who have survived their own stories can offer. "It means that some flowers grow even where no one believes they can. And when they do, they transform everything around them. That night, the garden lamp stayed lit longer than usual. The jasmine, as defiant as ever, kept blooming out of season. And as the empire eased into a new era, one more humane and wise, the names of Semel and Saphai had already become legend, whispered in marble halls and woven into folk songs. But in their private corner, they remained simply a man and a woman who had chosen love when all odds were against them, and had prevailed. Some stories are not merely read, they are felt. Saphai's is one of them. She was humiliated, cast aside, silenced. But instead of breaking, she took root. And in a world that seemed determined to deny her everything, she bloomed with the strength of one who never forgets who she is, nor what she deserves. Her love for Semel did not come from convenience or tradition. It was born of respect, of shared glances that sustain you, of words unspoken that still say everything. Now, as we close this final chapter, one truth remains: true love doesn't always come wrapped in silk, but it can transform empires. And you? What did this story leave in your heart? I invite you to share in the comments the moment that touched you the most. And if you made it here to the end, write the word Jasmine. That way, I'll know you were part of this journey to the very end, and that its message reached you. Don't forget, in the video cards I'm leaving you other stories full of emotion, unexpected turns, and unforgettable characters. If this one moved your heart, there are many more waiting to do the same. Thank you for joining me. Your presence makes every story bloom just a little more.